welcome to Girls Night In Online. I'm Jill Smolowe. I'm here today to share some reflections on the writing life, the most valuable lessons that I took at each stage, because they have all endured. They are all extremely real to me. My own career started actually while I was in college. I secured 2 summer internships. One of them was through the American Society of Magazine Editors, who assigned me 4 weeks each to Family Circle and Popular Science, 2 magazines in which I had 0 interest. And then the other internship was one that I created by offering to work for free at the Trenton Times. And when I got to each of these places, they seemed not to know what to do with, this teenage intern. And, in one case I was working for free, clipping clips in what was called the morgue, where you cut up the newspaper, stick it in files. This was all pre-computer. And I thought, well, but the reason I'm here is because I want to get some writing and reporting experience. So politely, but persistently, I kept letting them, these different editors at these different magazines know that I really wanted to write. And I am pleased to say, this was a high, by the end of each of those summers, I had clips at each of those publications. I had some magazine clips and I had some newspaper clips. And the lesson that I, internalized from this that is really important is that you have to speak up for yourself. Nobody's going to advocate for you when you go into a field like writing. You have to put yourself forward, be prepared for, some pushback, but let the people know what it is you want to be doing, and then go do it. So after college, thanks to these clips, and, I worked on the college newspaper and whatever, I got a job at the New York Times, and I am sure that sounds incredibly glamorous, and I assure you it was anything but. I was what was known as a copy girl, and this was again pre-computer. And so when pieces of paper needed to go across the 2-block newspaper room, an editor, a copy editor, a secretary would hold up their hand and they'd say copy, and I'd have to run over and snatch that piece of paper and run it to the other side of the newsroom. This was a horrible, horrible job. But again, I was persistent about wanting to report. And so on weekends, in the evenings, my days off, I would go. Initially, it was to do legwork for other reporters' stories. And then as, the editors started to know my work, they started letting me do my own pieces. And I spent 4 years at the New York Times, working my way up from copy girl to news assistant to, finally I was a cub reporter. But what I came to understand was the value of being in the room where it happens. I mean, it was a constant buzz of discussion about what is a story? What is the next day's story? How are we going to move this story forward a little bit more? How are we going to cut this story? All of these different things. And I emerged from my 4 years at the New York Times with what I think is a very strong news sense of what makes a story. And so the lesson that I share with you here is, it doesn't matter what level you were at some of these publications. It may seem like, oh, I don't want to be doing that, but being in on the discussion is invaluable. It's absolutely invaluable. After 4 years, I really wanted to focus more on the writing and less on the reporting. And the one place in the world you can do that and still be a paid journalist is to go to the news weeklies, where they divide. There are the people who go out and report, the correspondents, and then there are the people in New York who write the stories. It's like writing a term paper every week. And I would spend the next 35 years at the news weeklies. I was first a foreign affairs writer at Newsweek. Then I was a foreign affairs writer at Time magazine, which I then became their criminal justice writer. And then later I would go to people where, what was I there? I was the TV writer, the music writer, and the crime writer. my most valuable lesson was handed to me my first day on the job. And for anybody looking to write any kind of nonfiction form, be it an op-ed, an essay, a magazine piece, even a book, this was invaluable. The editor says to me, you know how to write a News Weekly story? And I said, no. And he grabs a piece of paper and he makes an outline, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he explains to me, each one of those are a paragraph or a graph in the business. And each of them are 20 lines. So we have a 100-line story. First paragraph, that's your lead. And that's a whole discussion unto itself, but that's, you know, how you get into your story. The second graph is why are we telling you the story this week? What is its significance? And what are basically the points, the themes we're going to trace? Then paragraphs 3, 4, 5. Each one of those is its own distinct universe. And if you touch on economics in paragraph 3, you don't talk about economics in paragraph 4 or 5. Move on. Paragraph 4 might be about the political implications of the economics and so forth. But it's a roadmap. And certainly when you're writing on deadline, as you are at a News Weekly, it's invaluable because you don't have time for wrong turns. But if you're writing at home, going through that exercise, forcing yourself to think about, well, what are the particular subjects, the particular themes I want to hit in the course of my work, doing that in advance is very, very useful. And my whole 35 years at the News Weeklies, I don't think there was a story I ever wrote that I didn't at least jot a rudimentary outline. Now, speaking of, I'm a big outliner, but speaking of outlines, while I was at Time, I came up with the idea for my first book, a memoir called An Empty Lap. And it happened to be a fairly hot topic, so I was fortunate to get an agent fairly easily. And she said to me, do you know how to write a book proposal so you could get an advance to write the book? And I said, no. Now, I repeat what I said back at Newsweek because that's also a valuable lesson. I learned early on that it does not pay to pretend to know what you don't know. It's much better to own up to that you'd like instruction because you'll learn valuable things. In this case, the agent gave me advice that has worked for every nonfiction book that I have published. She said, the way that you write a book proposal is you have to write a sample chapter. She said, and then you have to write detailed descriptions of each of the chapters that follow. So you hear there the rudiments of an outline. But this is what she added that is really valuable for any of you working on memoirs, which I believe some of you are. She said, for each of those chapter descriptions, make a separate outline or a list of the highs and the lows of whatever it is that you're going to be, what your story is going to be telling. And then make sure that each one of your chapter descriptions has one of those moments, whether it's a high or a low. So I did exactly what she told me. I got a glorious advance. Pocketbooks over at Simon & Schuster bought the book. Definitely a high. When that book came out, definitely a high. By the time I finished that book, I by then was a parent, and I really wanted to have greater flexibility in my schedule. So at the time, Time Inc. was offering one of its many RIFs, reduction in forces. So I took a buyout package and I went freelance for 3 years. And I happened to hit the timing just right. It was the height of the .com era. And I had no problem getting work. But I discovered something very quickly when I went freelance. Up until then, this was by now we're, I don't know, almost 20 years into my career. I had always had an editor who came to my door and said, this is what you're writing this week. This is your deadline. This is the number of words. And then I would dutifully, write the story and get it in on time. And whether the story ran, whether it was held or whether it was killed, I got paid. In other words, validation was built into the process. I had never questioned the validity, the value of what I was doing. Now, working at home on my own, like anybody who tries to, produce a piece of writing, there are good days, but there are bad days. And, then you start to question, should I be doing this? And is this worthwhile? And blah, blah, blah. So I did something that proved to be very, very smart. Another woman who had also recently left a magazine job and gone freelance, and we started a writing group. And our first meeting was just six people. We were all journalists. We were all going freelance. And that group, which I co-founded in 1996, we are still together. We are now 22 people. We meet monthly, once a month in each other's homes. Over the course of the years, the group has expanded to include, book writers and fiction writers. What we provide for each other is support. And more importantly, I think, when I look over the trajectory of the discussions we've had, we validate each other. Everybody goes through difficult times, and everybody feels like what they're writing is god awful, and oh my God, should I be doing something else? Having support, whether it's in a classroom or in a workshop or in a writer's group, is really, really useful. And another thing came out of this group for me, my second book. At the end of one of the sessions, one of the women came up to me and very quietly, she said to me, we both had adopted children, and she said, do you think there's an anthology in parenting adopted kids? And my new son said, you bet. And yes, that became my second book. That was with Riverhead, again, with an advance. But that book never would have happened if I hadn't had, this book group and these, in this case, women with wonderful ideas. So I highly recommend that if you're home alone writing, get yourself some support. It really, really helps. And book groups, of course, writing groups take all different forms. Our group does not share our writing. We may do that off on the side one-to-one with some of them. But there are groups that actually, it's a good place to go trial run your, a chapter or whatever it is. So there's that. 3 years on into this freelancing, one of my gigs was to, People Magazine has books. I had been writing books for them, and the magazine itself offered me a job. And I had already had close to 20 years at the news weeklies. I did not want to go back to a full-time job in a magazine, but I did want to write fiction. In fact, I had been writing fiction for several years. And I thought, well, I talked them into a 2-day-a-week job. It was the worst 2 days of the week, sort of when you have to actually write the story, close the story, all that stuff. But after a day of rest, that still left me 4 days a week to work on fiction. And over the next many years, I would produce 4 novels. And if you go to a bookstore, you will not find them. I did not publish any of them. 2 of them went back in the drawer, and 2 of them my agent did send out. And, it was disappointing. It is disappointing. And, getting myself back up to write the next one, see if I could do it better the next time, took some effort. And so I think that what I learned from this period for many years, 2 very important things. One is the value of what Annie Lamott famously calls shitty first drafts. Just get it down, because that's not what the book is. It's not in the writing, it's in the rewriting, and you have to keep at it. The other thing that I took from this period was an understanding that the joy isn't in the selling of the book. The joy is in the writing itself. And you need to know that. You need to really want to be there doing it, because you can only control the writing. You can't control what follows. And tenacity. Tenacity is very, very important. During, I guess, yeah, by the end of the people period, I spent something like 14 years there. I retired from journalism in 2015, I think it was, but in the final years there, I wrote what would become my third book, a memoir called 4 Funerals and a Wedding. And in that case, yes, I had my outline. I knew the highs and the lows. I knew what the points I wanted to hit. What I didn't know, though, was whether I would want to finish this book. As the title implies, this involved 4 funerals in my life. It was my husband, my sister, my mother, my mother-in-law. They had all died within 14 months of each other. And I had some things about grief that I felt could be very useful, but I wasn't so sure how useful it might be for me to go back into this material in a deep kind of way. So I didn't try to get a contract. And I did write the book. And it turned out it was a good thing I didn't try to get a contract, because when I sent it to my agent, this is the same agent through all these years, you know, she called me up and gave me the usual, I love it stuff. And then she said, I have to warn you, grief doesn't sell. I'm like, what does that mean? Grief doesn't sell? And she says, publishing houses have a terrible track record with selling grief books. They don't want to buy them. And sure enough, she sent it out to, I think, you know, like 15, 16 houses, and they all came back saying the same thing. We have a terrible track record on grief. We're not going to take this book. But I had a manuscript that I really believed in. I believed it had a story that would be of use to a certain segment of the grieving population, and I very much wanted to get it published. And this was right at the beginning of what now has become quite popular, what are called hybrid houses. And some of you may have been on some of the other writers who have been on Girls Night In, who have spoken from She Writes Press. I was in the second class of She Writes authors. And the deal with a hybrid house like that is it's curated, meaning they have a limited list per season. They only, you know, so they pick and choose which books they will take. But the author fronts the money to actually publish the book, and then collects on the back end, if you're lucky, in royalties. And here's the amazing thing. I have actually sold more copies of 4 Funerals through this hybrid house than Simon and Schuster sold on my first memoir. The lesson I learned here was that you can do it. You know, for me, the vehicle that was the most effective was to write essays. And I stripped out, you know, every possible iteration of grief that I could think of. And I placed essays every place from the New York Times Week in Review to Bark magazine for pets, pet lovers, because, you know, people lose pets, they grieve too. What's so great about essays is that at the bottom, they say that all important line, Jill Smolowe is the author of 4 Funerals and a Wedding. That puts your title in front of potential readers. And it's a very, very effective tool to market your book. So I left, you know, News Weekly Writing in 2015. And since then, to wrap up, I continue to write essays. I write regularly for a PBS site called Next Avenue. And I now teach a memoir workshop, which I'm loving the teaching, I gotta tell you. I had a very, very hard time after I finished 4 Funerals coming up with the topic of my next book. And this is the final thing I want to share with you. I finally thought, what do I know best right now in the universe? And it was that I'm not writing. So I wrote a book called On Not Writing. And it took me 2 years, and I fought this manuscript. I have to tell you, I fought it. But the way that I got this book done was that I made a rule for myself. It was the first time in all these decades that I didn't want to sit down and write. I had always wanted to, and here I was resisting it. So I made a rule. I'm going to write it at least 1 hour a day. And I have to tell you, 2 years later, I have a book. And my agent has it now, and who knows in this crazy COVID climate, what will happen or what won't. But the lesson that I learned or relearned is that you've got to show up every day. It's not fun every day, but you got to show up every day. And if you do, the rewards are there in the writing itself. So that I would like to throw it open to your questions. I'll open up the chat. By the way, I'm going to be giving a copy of 4 Funerals and a Wedding to the first person whose question I see when I open up chat. So let me open it up here. And who is Jen Jones? She, Jen? Okay, well, anyway, tips on reinvigorating interest in your book. How do you continue to cultivate more interest? So, essays. Every time, I'm telling you, if your memoir will have some central theme from which you can pluck off ideas for essays, I can actually track the effect my essays have, because when you publish, Amazon has this thing called Amazon Central that actually counts, each week gives you a counting of how many books you've sold, not the ebooks, but the hard books. And I can tell when an essay of mine runs, here I am, my 4 Funerals came out in 2014, and here I am in 2020, and I can still see an uptick every time I write an essay. That's my best tip for reinvigorating interest in books, that are past their shelf life. There are questions? Okay, whoops, I see somebody's lips moving, but you have to unmute to ask if Flora, is that? No, okay. All right, okay, here's one. How do you promote a book from a beginning? What do you do with social media? Okay, I am not the best person on this, because I absolutely have a website, which you need, because you need somewhere to anchor the book, to show your other writings, to have connections to not only Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but to independent bookstores. I also, I have a Facebook author page, and the way that I used my particular page was to post other people's writings about grief as well as my own. So I have built an audience there for people looking for materials on grief. I have a Twitter thing, but I don't use it. There are other people who are far more adept with social media than I am. But those are the main prongs: a website, a Facebook author page, and Twitter. For those of you who are better versed than I, maybe there's a way to do it on Instagram. I'm not familiar with that particular platform. From Heather, do you ever try to transform and resubmit books not published after submitted? Oh yes, Heather, I do. I have tried with my novels. I have gone back, I have retooled them, I have sent them to other agents, because I'm not going to ask my agent to go out with that again, but I have not had any success with that. First time memoir on grief, any suggestions on where to publish? Self or hybrid? Do your essays reflect any portion of your book? Okay, that's from Judy. The beauty of a self-published book is you can take anything that you want from it to put into essay form. Because I did it with a hybrid house too, that material is mine. I didn't actually strip out chapters and put them up, but I would grab sections and then retool them for different themes that whatever the particular article essay was about. I don't think that you would be able to do that if you publish with a traditional press. I mean, take actual language, because that's their domain, not yours. And one more question. How do you submit books if you do not have an agent? I am afraid I don't know the answer to that. You got to get an agent. That's the way that it works. Unless you can make a personal contact within a house. They're the middle guys. So you kind of need an agent. Unless you're self-publishing, then you can do it yourself. So if any of you would like to unmute to say goodbye, it's been a pleasure spending this time with you. And good luck with your writing. Hang in there.